So what then is full employment? When do we have full employment in our story in Chapter 8? We have full employment when the labor market comes to equilibrium. Is that correct? So in other words, we have full employment when this is true, when the labor market comes to equilibrium, and equilibrium, of course, occurs where the labor demand and labor supply curves intersect. So that's where we have full employment, correct? Now, according to this diagram, at a real wage of $50, the quantity supplied of labor equals the quantity demanded of labor. Is that correct? Now, what's the quantity demanded of labor? That would be the number of jobs that firms wish to fill in terms of man hours. Correct? And the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the number of man hours that workers choose to work. So in this scenario then, at equilibrium, what is true? Well, at equilibrium, we have equality between the number of hours that workers choose to work and the number of hours that firms wish to employ. Right? In other words, everyone who wishes to work has a job then at equilibrium, correct? However, I mentioned in class last time that you have to take this with a pinch of salt, which is to say that it's not quite that everyone who wishes to work has a job. It's not quite that. Why? Because even in labor market equilibrium, you have one small category of unemployed workers. They will always be there, correct? And who are those workers? The naturally unemployed, exactly. Frictionally and structurally unemployed. So these are workers who want to work, who are looking for work, but haven't quite found a job yet, even when the labor market is in equilibrium, right? Now, the natural rate of unemployment. What is the natural rate of unemployment? It is the number of the naturally unemployed as a percentage of the labor force, right? And in the US, the natural rate of unemployment is believed to be about 4%, correct? Nothing new here. I've mentioned all of this before. Now, what determines the natural rate of unemployment? And here we have some factors. So here are some of the factors that affect the number of the naturally unemployed. And we spoke about this at the end of class last time. First one was the pace of demographic change. If you have a young population, then chances are that the natural rate of unemployment is going to be higher. Why is that? Because with a younger population, you have every year a very large number of high school and college graduates. You have every year a large number of new entrants to the labor force. And these people, they may have skills that are currently in demand, but it will take them a short while to find a job. So they will be frictionally unemployed in the interim. Is that correct? So with a young population, leads to a high natural rate of, my stylus is not working very well today. We'll do the best we can. Okay. The second point I mentioned was the generosity of unemployment benefits. If the government is very generous with its unemployment benefits, the number of the naturally unemployed is likely to be higher. Why is that? Because job searchers will prolong their job search. They will be more choosy about accepting job offers because the government is looking after them in the meantime, right? Third, the pace of structural change. If you have an economy in which a lot of industries are rapidly dying away because of changes in technology, changes in international patterns of comparative advantage, well, that's an economy in which there will be large numbers of structurally unemployed workers. Correct? And this too will lead to a large number of naturally unemployed workers a higher rate of natural unemployment. Now I'm going to talk about something that I didn't talk about at the end of our last class. Some other factors that may also cause the number of the naturally unemployed to increase. And here we are. Now here are three reasons that might also be associated with a larger number of naturally unemployed workers. And for this, I need the following diagram. Once again, we have here the diagram for the labor market. And so in this diagram, what is the equilibrium real wage? Somebody, can you identify the equilibrium real wage in this diagram? Well, come on. $50, exactly. That's where the two curves intersect. Is that right? But what if the real wage is prevented from falling all the way down to $50? What if some forces keep the real wage stuck at $60 instead of $50? You see that red horizontal line? Right? Now, if this were to happen, and I'll discuss the reasons why this might happen in a minute. If this happens, you will see right away that a horizontal gap opens up between the labor demand and labor supply curves. Correct? How would you think of this gap? How would you interpret this horizontal gap between the two curves? The gap I'm talking about, of course, is this gap here. Well, what would you call that? Would you call that an excess supply of labor or surplus labor? Wouldn't that be surplus labor? Because at that wage of $60, workers wish to supply 240 billion hours. Is that correct? Can you read that off the curve here? So 60 goes sideways like that, and then vertically down like this, so that's 240 labor hours. That's the quantity supplied of labor by workers. Firms, on the other hand, at that wage of $60, would want to hire only 175 billion hours. So you have this excess supply or surplus labor. Now you would think of this surplus labor as hours that workers wish to work, but now they can't find work. Correct? So this gap, 240 minus 175, so many billion hours then are going to be unemployed. These are workers who wish to work, but firms won't hire them. Correct? Now you can think of these unemployed workers as also adding to the naturally unemployed. So besides the number of naturally unemployed who exist at equilibrium, at this point itself, besides the number of naturally unemployed who exist at equilibrium, now we have some additional naturally unemployed workers, because the real wage is somehow prevented from falling all the way down to its equilibrium value of $50. Correct? So this too then raises the natural rate of unemployment. Now what factors might cause the wage to not fall all the way down to $50? What would prevent the wage from falling to its equilibrium value? And here are these factors. And I'm going to start with the bottommost factor, union wage. Now, there was a time when labor unions were very powerful in the US. They're not so powerful now, but there was a time when labor unions were exceedingly powerful. And so labor unions could lobby for a higher real wage, a real wage that was greater than the equilibrium real wage. You see, labor unions could threaten to go on strike or something if management didn't comply with their demands. So they could hold industry hostage in a sense. And so the real wage might be prevented then from falling all the way to its equilibrium value. Okay, so that's the first reason. The second reason is minimum wages. Now this is something the government sets. And the government may set the minimum wage at a level that is greater than the equilibrium real wage. Now what would motivate the government to do this? To set a higher minimum wage? Well, the government is going to be motivated by the welfare of workers. If the government thinks that the equilibrium real wage is too low to afford American workers a decent standard of living, well, that's when the government may step in with a higher minimum wage. Correct? So that's another factor that may then prevent the real wage from falling all the way down to its equilibrium value. And finally, efficiency wages. Now, in this story, firms themselves choose to pay their workers a wage higher than the equilibrium real wage. Now, in your last exam, the very first question, if you recall, spoke about Henry Ford offering his workers $5 a day back in 1914. Now, $5 a day back then was an unheard of wage. It was way higher than what the other factories were paying. Now, why did Henry Ford do this, do you think? On his own, pay his workers more. Does that make business sense for a firm to, on its own, pay workers more than what it can get away paying them? You say no. You say yes. Why?
Well, at my job right now, TJX Companies is raising their minimum wage to 9.
Uh-huh.
And I was speaking to the manager about it, and he said that the company would rather pay more so their workers can work harder, and to pay less their work throughout the workforce throughout the year. They only 30% of the workers actually stay with the company for the year, so they think if they pay us more people would stay, and that causes less
turnover.
Yes, and turnover, and they would waste less money training new people every year.
Exactly. That's precisely. So let me summarize. Why would firms pay their workers higher than the equilibrium wage? Well, you pay workers more, the worker is a happier worker. They therefore work harder. They're also likely to stay with the company longer, you see? And that's something companies like, because if workers leave and they have to hire new workers and retrain them at company expense, well, that's all very expensive. Correct? So sometimes it makes sense for a company to pay workers a wage that is higher than the equilibrium wage, right? And this is what's called efficiency wages. Wages designed to bring about more efficient workers, right? So for these three reasons, the real wage may be prevented from falling all the way down to $50 an hour. So it's going to be 60 in this story because of those three reasons. Okay, so this is the last thing that I wanted to complete in this chapter. So we now have a good sense of what full employment is. Full employment occurs when the labor market comes to equilibrium, right? And that then translates to a certain amount of real GDP produced, which is potential real GDP, correct? And we now know the various influences on the natural rate of unemployment. With that, I will end this chapter and begin the next one.